Good afternoon, all. This week we are discussing our double portion of Parshat VaYakhel Pekudei, why, when, and where we gather. And we also come to a close of Sefer Shmot, beginning next week with VaYikra. This particular Parsha, VaYakhel, in the Chabad calendar, carries significance. And this is where we will begin this week's discussion. This week's Torah reading tells us how Moshe commanded the Jewish people to build the sanctuary, the Mishkan, for God in the desert. And the Jews eagerly responded, giving and working to construct this dwelling. The reading called VaYakhel, and he gathered, talks about how Moshe gathered all of the people, the entire Jewish nation, together for this endeavor. This, our Chabad friends teach us, is an important lesson. For when building the sanctuary where godliness will be revealed, one must establish unity amongst the Jewish people. In our prayers, we say, "Bless us, our Father, all as one." Our commentaries explain that when only we are all as one, will we then have a fit place for God's blessing to be bestowed and for God's presence to be felt. To explain this in the personal sphere, our Chabad friends teach as follows. There are individuals who pride themselves on spiritual sensitivity and refinement. Such refinement must be reflected in better and more encompassing relations with their fellow human beings. It is only through self-transcendence that one can appreciate the spiritual, and the most practical experience of self-transcendence occurs in relationship with other people. Sequence is also important. We begin with VaYakhel, establishing togetherness. Begin by breaking down the barriers that separate one Jew from another, and this itself will make it possible for the barriers preventing the manifestation of godliness in this world to be overcome. In these last parts of the book of Shemot, we are told how the B'nai Yisrael actually followed the directions to build the portable Mishkan as instructed earlier. Notice that we are reading about this experience after last week's misstep in building something they were not commanded to construct, namely the Egel Masecha. The building of this portable presence of God that they will take with them wherever they go teaches us something important about our own Jewish identity. That is, wherever we are, it is right there with us, in our time, in our space, and in our community. Further, it is through the spiritual journey of the collective that individuals are kept in check, finding their own fulfillment within the context of community. This is a most timely message as we find ourselves in the season of significant communal celebrations with their excitement, spiritual potential, and so much more. We are reminded here yet again that the B'nai Yisrael are happy to participate in the building of the Mishkan and more than ready to provide all of the special materials to make it beautiful and singularly special. In fact, Moshe has to tell them at some point that they've done enough and to stop donating things. We read in chapter 35, verses 29, every man and woman whose heart inspired them, kol ish v'isha asher nadav libam otam lahavi l'chol ha'malacha, to bring for the work that the Lord who had commanded them to make through Moshe, the children of Israel brought a gift for the Lord. Heviu b'nei Yisrael nedava ladoshem. Nedava is singular, and it reflects that all of them joined together to bring this special gift. Earlier, we read in this parak, Vayamru al Moshe le'mor, they said to Moshe, the people are bringing so much, marbimam lahavi miteh the malacha, for more than enough for the work of what we are doing than what God has commanded. They have given it their all, and they are totally dedicated to it. In chapter 36, as we continue, verse 6, so, Vayitzav Moshe v'yaviru kol b'machaneh lemor ish v'isha al yasu od malaka l'trumat hakodesh VaYakhel ha'am lavi. Moshe commands and says, let no one do anything else for this offering for God. So the people stopped bringing. And Rashi tells us the word here is unusual, VaYakhel, that they were forced to hold back. That this was not their choice. They wanted to keep bringing more, but because they were told to hold back, they did. And at this point, we're told the work was sufficient for all of them to do it, and v'hutar, there was left over. There was an excess of needed material. Indeed, there was great excitement and a desire to be part of this special initiative. That being said, there are limits as well. This is an important reminder for all of us as we celebrate, observe, and do our best to acknowledge who we are individually as well as collectively, in between the excesses of Purim and the excessive preparation for Pesach. The power for us individually is in the collective of which we are part, not in singular flights of self-perceived importance. As the first year after Shemitah, the year of 5783 in which we find ourselves is designated as a VaYakhel year, a year of communal, collective gathering. This has special meaning for and is emphasized in the Chabad community. This is what our contemporary Chabad teachers want us to think and consider. Picture this scene. Millions of Jews, men, women, infants, their great-grandmothers, scholars, and lay people, assembled in Yerushalayim. A hush falls over the mammoth crowd as the royally bedecked King of Israel ascends onto the platform and reads sections of the Holy Torah. The nation is inspired, invigorated. A display of unity and a statement of purpose converge to revitalize and refocus a multifarious people. Though seemingly improbable, this scene repeated itself in ancient Yerushalayim on a septennial basis, and when this temple will soon be rebuilt, as our Chabad friends and others teach, the practice will be renewed with Mashiach himself reading from the Torah scroll. We get this from Devarim, chapter 31, verses 10 through 12, at which time we read, at the end of every 7 years, at an appointed time in the festival of Sukkot, following the year of Shemitah, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place that God will choose, you shall read this Torah before all of Israel. Assemble the people, the men, the women, the children, v'chule v'chule, and it goes on. Everyone is included. In ancient Israel, every 7th year was the Shemitah year, not just a matter of where you buy your fruits and vegetables. It had much greater meaning. For an entire year, the nation's economy came to a standstill, as all farmers and agrarian workers abandoned their fields and flocked en masse to the study houses, where for a full year they focused on their spiritual rather than their physical needs. Now, at the onset of the 8th year, the first year after the Shemitah, the nation is ready to head back to the fields and orchards. But first, on the second day of the holiday of Sukkot, 16 days into the new year, all gather in the holy temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, for a dose of inspiration to tide them over for the next 6 years, most of which time would be spent working. This event is what was known as VaYakhel, assemble. It was the only event that required the attendance of every single Jew, reminiscent of the historical moment when our nation stood at Mount Sinai, when every member of our nation was present, when God lovingly gave us the Torah. Think about this. Is the Mishkan a home for God? Is it rather the gathering of all of B'nai Yisrael that make it so? How are these two inextricably connected? If we think about our own lives and our daily work and our daily trajectory of everything we do, what is most important about our home? Is it a house? Is it a structure? but what makes it a home? What is most important about the space that we live in, that we pray in, that we eat in, that we have family gatherings in? Again, what is the most important thing to us in our lives? The things we collect, the materials such as those that Moshe told the B'nai Yisrael must speak of are enough, don't bring any more? Or is it something else? Is it that which we fashion by our collective and unified efforts? We also talk about the importance of Shabbat at this point, even before the recounting of the Mishkan, as Parsha VaYakhel begins. And Moshe called the entire community of the children of Israel to assemble. VaYakhel Moshe akol adat b'nei Yisrael v'yamar alehem ela davarim asher tzivah Hashem la'asot otam. These are the things that God has commanded that you do. Sheisha yamim ta'aseh melacha b'yom hashvi'i yeh lechem kodesh shabbat shabbaton l'Hashem kol aseh b'malacha yumat. 6 days work may be done. The 7th day you will rest. It will be a day of sanctity. Yeh lechem kodesh Shabbat Shabbaton l'Hashem, a full rest, a full stop, where we just are there and praise God and enjoy our homes, our places, our Batei Knesset. Whoever performs work on this day shall surely die. Rashi says that Moshe prefaced the discussion of the details of the work of the Mishkan with the warning to keep the Shabbat, to teach that even work as important as building a Mishkan, the effort that was to bring everybody together, does not supersede Shabbat. What pushes Shabbat aside? Sakanat nefashot dochet Shabbat. If someone is in danger, imminent danger, we save a life on Shabbat. But we do not engage in these creative, no matter what the purpose is, no matter how lofty the goal is, efforts on Shabbat. Let's think about this, friends. The Mishkan is portable, and it occupies space. Shabbat is something that is determined by time. Neither of these things are constantly and actively present in a sense. And yet when Moshe was not to be seen, the B'nai Yisrael needed something that they perceived as permanent to see at all times that would make them feel secure. This is how we end up with the Egel HaZahav. This was clearly misguided, as the Mishkan and the Shabbat are not just symbols of all that they are, but the very embodiment of their collective souls. The Mishkan being the result of their unified effort to create this beautiful space in which God would dwell, and the Shabbat on which to focus on our relationship to God and God's dwelling in our lives. So how do we remember that these are permanent fixtures in our lives, with Shabbat coming once per weekly cycle and a portable Mishkan that represents God's presence, also something we cannot see? So let's think about time and space for a moment. Consider this. Time is shared. Space can be owned and lead to power. What is more valued and why? Which most influences the other? How do each help to make and define community as we know it? Nechama Leibowitz teaches that God created the universe for humanity to live and flourish. We created the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary, to bring God's presence into our midst. What is she teaching us by this comment? I believe that she is reminding us that how we live and flourish has to have a higher purpose for the collective beyond individual aspirations. That is the power of the Mishkan. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zichron L'Shalom, makes a most interesting observation about the accounting of materials that is reported as we come to the close of Sefer Shemot. Here we have in Parshat Pekudei a completely and transparent detailed account of how the donations to the building of the Mishkan were used. For example, in chapter 38, verse 21 of Shemot, of Exodus, we read, "These are the amounts," this is the summation, "these are the amounts of the materials used for the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the tabernacle of the testimony, which were recorded at Moshe's command by the Levites under the direction of Itamar, son of Aharon, the priest." The passage goes on to list the exact amounts of gold, silver, and bronze collected, as well as other materials, and the purposes to which every material that was collected were used. Why does Moshe do this? What is the significance of this repetition at precisely this point, at the completion of this book, of our becoming a nation? And before we get to the laws of purity, separation, limits and boundaries that will characterize the third book of our Chumash, Sefer VaYakhel, the book of Leviticus. This is where Rabbi Sacks wants us to consider an aspect of Moshe as our paradigmatic leader, and how Moshe understood his mission, taking great effort to avoid any misunderstanding of his position. I find this particularly interesting when we are being subjected to a 24/7, well, for those of us who observe Shabbat, at least we get 25 hours off. And with Pesach coming, it will be more. But this continuous news feed of leaders, their corruption, how the leadership went to their heads, how they do not feel like they need to make an accounting to the rest of us, to whom they are responsible, not allowed to abuse, and yet they do. So the Midrash provides us with an explanation. In Tanchuma Buber Pekudei 4, they gazed after Moshe. People criticized Moshe. They used to say to one another, "Look at that neck, look at those legs. Moshe is eating and drinking what belongs to us. All that Moshe has belongs to us." The other would reply, "A man who is in charge of the work of the sanctuary, what do you expect? That he shouldn't get rich?" As soon as he heard this, Moshe replied, "By your life, as soon as the sanctuary is complete, I will make a full reckoning with you." These are the amounts of the materials used for the tabernacle, which were recorded at Moshe's command by the Levites, the objective accountants, if you will, under the direction of Itamar, son of Aharon, the priest. What Moshe is teaching us is that by issuing a detailed reckoning, he would avoid coming under suspicion that he had in any way personally appropriated some of the donated money. Note the emphasis that the accounting was not taken by Moshe himself, but by the Levites under the direction of Itamar. In other words, by independent auditors. There is no hint of these accusations in the text itself, but the Midrash may be based on the remark Moshe makes during the Korach rebellion later in the book of Numbers, where he says, "I have not taken as much as a donkey for them, nor have I wronged any of them," when insults are hurled his way. Accusations of corruption and personal enrichment have often been leveled against leaders with or without justification. We might think that since God sees all that we do, this is enough to safeguard against wrongdoing. Yet Judaism does not say this. Moshe's own accountability here is to be understood as above reproach, precisely because he indicated that not only would it be done, but this accounting would be taken by an independent source under the direction of another independent source, not accountable to him. Think about that in terms of what's going on in our various governments, such as the United States, Israel, and others. This is not to be taken lightly, I think, in terms of what we observe daily in our own leadership and the liberties too often assumed by those who are to be responsible to the collective, not take for themselves. Within Pekudei, we find the repetition of the garments of the Kohen HaGadol. Note that the details that are recounted regarding the most beautiful part of the garb, the choshen, as crafted by Bezalel and his artists. We read, he made the choshen, the work of a master weaver, like the work of the ephod, of gold and blue and purple and crimson wool, and twisted them. It was square. They made it and they doubled it. Its length one span, its width one span. And they filled it with 4 rows of stones. And then it goes on to indicate the stones in each of the rows. And the stones were for the names of the sons of the Israel tribe, corresponding to their names, the engravings of the seal, every one according to his name, for the 12 tribes. They made the chains at the edges of pure gold, and they made 2 gold settings and 2 gold rings, and they placed the 2 rings on the 2 ends of the choshen. This choshen represents the people and their entirety, both their individuality as tribes and their collective identity being joined together in this one plate. And the Kohen HaGadol wears it over his heart, physically representing the people to whom he is accountable. While the tzitz, the plate, focusing the Kohen HaGadol on God, God's supervision of him, God's watching him, his accountability to God is on his forehead. Just as the totality of the people and their relationship is present in the very garb of the Kohen HaGadol, the Mishkan is the garb for the collective. And within all of this, the Shabbat is part of the mindfulness of the limits of this as well when we begin VaYakhel. Yes, the B'nai Yisrael will gather for this wonderful initiative, and the details are repeated to remind them of their authentic identity and all that God commands them to express this, while also reminding them of the limits and observance of God's set timing. I do glass art. It's a hobby that I picked up. Thank you, Julie, my teacher. And the glass, it's beautiful. I love working with it. I love creating things with it. It's relaxing. It's meditative. I don't do it on Shabbat. It is a creative act, and I don't do it on Shabbat. They are being told and reminded about the beauty of all the parts of the garb of the Mishkan. And they are reminded in the beginning not to do it on Shabbat. Shabbat is the Yom HaNucha, the day of rest, the day of thinking, the day of contemplation, the day of restoration, the day of recalibrating who we are and remembering our limits as human beings. We cannot work 24/7, even though we often use that phrase. It can be debilitating. It can create all kinds of health problems. We have to rest for many reasons, both for our own well-being, for our collective well-being, and for our relationship to God. Avraham Joshua Heschel taught, among others, that more than Jews keep Shabbat, the Shabbat keeps the Jews. Whatever else is going on in our lives, we stop fully every 7th day to consider, to reflect, to energize, to remember who, where, and what we are. It is indeed fitting that as we come to the close of Sefer Shemot, the very book that describes how we became the nation of B'nai Yisrael, as we know this entity, we are reminded about our Mishkan and all of its glorious details. The Kohen HaGadol, who is intended to shepherd the collective spiritual entity known as B'nai Yisrael, and the Shabbat on which we gather and rest before God in an ongoing regimen, is part of who we are. So as we end Sefer Shemot, and we consider why, when, and where we gather, we learn about what really makes our community and how we are all part of that community. We all say the following at one time as a community in our collective space. Chazak, chazak, v'nitchazek. Be strong, let us be strong. Let us always feel the power of why, when, and where we gather. Shabbat Shalom.